Right. Morning, everybody. From a very chilly Cape Town. Our offices are in Newlands. Welcome to another one of our webcasts. This is our third. Our first one was on offshore investing, and then we did living annuities, and today we're doing estate planning. I'm Nick Brummer. Our fellow director, Stuart, is going to be presenting. I might chip in here and there. In case Investonline, you're not sure, we're a financial planning business. We're a team of 13 non-professionals and 4 admin. Investonline's been going now for 15 years as we've grown and provide obviously a very professional, cost-effective and efficient service. We essentially a financial planning business that gives you independent advice and investment advice and strategy. So with that, Stuart, over to you.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Today we're going to be covering the basics of estate planning. So I'm just going to go through what we're going to cover. And Nick, please chip in at any time. So the presentation should be going for about 30 minutes. And then we do have allocated some time for questions. We don't have a live Q&A going, but there were quite a lot of questions that were pre-submitted, and we've selected some just to cover on the recording as well. So what are we going to go through? Essentially, what is estate planning? The estate costs and taxes to be aware of and plan for. Understanding the certain allowances and deductions that you can claim against those costs. What is the estate winding up process and how long does it take? The importance of beneficiary nominations and what is a beneficiary nomination? Some nice practical examples, the key documents that we suggest you have in place, and then just a bit of framework for choosing the right professionals. So estate planning, what is it? Estate planning is the process of organizing and managing your assets and financial affairs to ensure they are handled according to your wishes in the event of incapacitation or death. So really, you've got your assets, your investments, whatever it may be, and you've got certain wishes or intentions for those assets. If you can no longer, enjoy ownership of them, making sure that your intentions are carried through the way you want them to be. So the objectives of estate planning, achieve efficient deceased estate administration. And when we go through the winding up process, I'll talk a little bit more about what that administration is and what it looks like. To provide future growth of assets outside of the estate planner's estate. So what does that mean? That's essentially if you've got certain assets that are expected to continue to grow until you pass away. It can sometimes be strategic to place the ownership of those assets either in a family member's name or if you've got a trust or a company, and rather have those assets sit outside of your estate and in someone else's estate or in the company. But that's very much would be on a case-by-case basis that one would have to analyze that. To appoint your heirs or beneficiaries, what's called legatees, essentially who's going to receive your assets. To minimize the impact of tax. Provide for liquidity. So liquidity is basically having enough money, cash available in the estate to pay for the costs that are associated with an estate. And we've got some really nice examples on how it practically works with providing for liquidity and some potential solutions to make sure you've got enough liquidity. And to take account of offshore assets. So we've got about 2-3 slides, which is basically the bookwork that I'll just try to go through as simply as possible. So what are the main estate costs and taxes? I think the big one is estate duty. Estate duty in South Africa is really the tax levied on the estate of a deceased person. before the assets are distributed to beneficiaries. So it's charged on all the assets, what's called property, in one's estate after you pass away. It does exclude certain assets like retirement funds. What is the tax rate? So each person in South Africa is allowed 3.5 million rand in assets before estate duty will be levied. Thereafter, for the next 30 million rand, the standard estate duty rate is 20%. So it's quite a big tax rate that the government charge. If your dutiable estate is above 30 million rand, it's then taxed at 25%. So that's almost that new wealth tax band that SARS introduced a few years ago. And what I've also just included here is inheritance tax. I think often there can be confusion between estate duty and inheritance tax. And I know inheritance tax is a much commonly used term around the world, and for those who with ties to the UK or the US. So in South Africa, we don't have inheritance tax. We don't charge, or SARS don't charge tax on the recipient of assets. SARS charges tax on the estate itself. So inheritance tax in South Africa is 0%. What SARS explains is that the asset inherited is considered a capital receipt and is therefore not included in the beneficiary's gross income. The next fee to be aware of is executive fees. So the executor of an estate is the individual or firm of attorneys or whatever it might be, fiduciary practice, that are appointed to wind up and do the administration for a deceased estate. Now, that individual or company is going to charge a fee for the work that they do. That fee is calculated using certain assets that the executor will be involved in handling. Those assets would normally be one's bank accounts or savings accounts, your normal unit trust investments. If there's no beneficiary nomination, that would be handled by the executor. Your physical properties that you own, your normal assets that you own, such as cars and boats or whatever it might be, those are all subject to executor fees. And what's excluded from the calculation of executive fees are assets with beneficiary nominations, which we'll talk about a little bit just now. So things like life insurance policies or endowments or retirement funds. So the executive fee, the rate for an executive fee, the standard rate that's allowed in South Africa is 3.5% plus VAT. So it comes to about 4%. So if you just think about that, for every 1 million rand of assets that the executor handles, it's up to 40,000 rand that the executor will charge on handling that. For 10 million rand, 400,000 rand. So executive fee is unlike estate duty. Estate duty can be quite hard to, avoid. What you can try and do is manage estate duty, but executive fees, you can really avoid it by putting certain steps in place. Executive fees can be negotiated. So if you appoint in an executor while you're still alive and you know you've got a sizable estate, normally an estate of 10 million or more, then you can negotiate a lower fee with the executor. The final sort of cost to be aware of, or tax, is capital gains tax. So this one is the same whether you trigger a capital gain in life or you pass away with unrealized capital gains. I know there's a lot of individuals we see that have had funds or shares for a long time that are sitting on what's called like an unrealized capital gain, which is basically the profit that you haven't triggered yet or you haven't sold yet. And whether you pay that capital gains tax in life or in death, the rate is the same. So for individuals, the effective rate depends on your personal tax rate, and the size of the capital gain can affect that tax rate. So essentially the capital gain will be anywhere between 7% and 18% if you're an individual. If you've got an investment portfolio that's rather held in a wrapper or an endowment, I know we covered these investment products quite extensively on our offshore webinar, then the capital gains aren't being seen as being triggered by you as an individual, because the wrapper or an endowment pays its own capital gains tax. And that capital gains tax is at a flat rate of 12%. So if you pass away with the wrapper assets, the capital, you can potentially have quite a large capital gains tax saving if that asset has grown, quite largely over a large number of years. So just briefly to cover, what's called allowances and deductions. So these are the amounts that you are able to use to reduce what's called your property for the calculation of estate duty. So as I mentioned earlier, everybody is allowed 3.5 million rand of assets before they pay estate duty. That's known as your primary abatement. And then another big deduction is called the Section 4Q deduction. And that says that any assets going from one married person or spouse to another married person or spouse is not subject to estate duty. So that is exempt. And that's why for a lot of people where the assets it's not a complex estate and the assets go from one spouse to another, you wouldn't pay estate duty on that first transfer of assets. You would only pay estate duty when the second surviving spouse passes away, and then that second surviving spouse would pay estate duty on all those combined assets. In that case, where the first spouse didn't use their 3.5 million rand, the second surviving spouse could enjoy an abatement of 7 million rand, because it would be each spouse's amount, that the first spouse's amount would roll over. So 7 million rand could be deducted against that whole estate. What other deductions can you claim? So basically any costs or liabilities that the estate has to pay. This includes your final tax bill, your capital gains tax that will be due to SARS, your executor's fees, and any other liabilities, repayments of loan accounts or bonds, that can all be claimed against estate duty in terms of that property calculation. You're also allowed to, as a deduction, use your funeral costs up to 50,000 rand, as well as your administration costs, which would be the application fees to the master's office. And then if you had to bequeath any of your money to charity, that's a registered public benefits organization, you can claim that as a deduction to estate duty. So if you feel like being very charitable and bequeathing everything to charity, you would basically not have to pay estate duty on those amounts, because the government allows those to be estate duty free. On capital gains tax, so in life, each individual is allowed what's called an exclusion from capital gains tax of 40,000 rand per tax year. Now, when you pass away, they give you a once-off exclusion that's higher, quite a bit higher. It's 300,000 rand you're allowed when you pass away. So that does give a little bit of an additional reprieve for assets that are triggering capital gains on death. And then the same thing with primary residence. It's the same in life as in death, is that you allow 2 million rand as a capital gain for your primary home that you live in before you are going to be levied tax. So if you sell your house for a profit of under 2 million rand, or you pass away with your house being at a market value that is at a profit but less than 2 million rand than what you bought it for, you won't be liable for any capital gains tax on that house. Okay, and then I thought it would be interesting just to touch on the actual winding up process, because I know certainly, I think a lot of people would never think about this. I know certainly 10 years ago, I wouldn't have had an idea. Unfortunately, in our job, you do go through these administration processes quite a bit, so you get familiar with the different steps and the time that each step can take. So the first step when someone passes away is obviously the family need to report that. So that would involve, you get the death certificate and the little notification from the police, SAPS, of the passing away of the individual. You would then inform the bank and your financial institutions about the passing away of that person. If you've pre-nominated an executor, you would also inform them. Then the executor would either need to be nominated, or if there's someone that was pre-nominated, and that person would now need to apply to the master's office to be formally appointed by the master's, the master's office as the executor to represent the estate. That appointment has been taking quite a long time, since COVID. I know the master's office has notoriously had quite a backlog, but we do understand that time has been improving. Once the master's office has rubber stamped that executor, now that executor can legally act on behalf of the estate. The first step is that the executor must advertise the estate publicly. There's normally a publication where the estate would be published, and the reason for that is really to allow any creditors or anybody who feels they might have a say on the estate to come forward. And I think that time period is 30 days that estate needs to be advertised for. Once that formality is passed, the executor will start doing really the accounting work of trying to get an inventory and valuation of all the property that would be in the estate. Remember, the executor is not dealing with the retirement funds or anything with beneficiary nominations. It's only dealing with assets that they are going to handle. So they would get the valuation of that. They would also potentially include valuation of other assets for the calculation of estate duty. And once that's all calculated, they're going to pay all those expenses we mentioned earlier. They're going to pay estate duty, they're going to pay capital gains tax and the final tax bill. They're going to pay themselves the executive fee. And then whatever's left is going to be distributed through what's called the liquidation and distribution account. So that liquidation distribution account would take all the wishes of the person through their will and who's going to receive what. And that would basically, the executor would see what's practical, who's going to get X amounts of money or what assets, and the executor would, administer all of that. And then the final step is to distribute those assets. And when the executor is done with everything, they would then inform the master's office that they've done their duty in the executor, and the estate would be closed. That whole process, can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on the complexity of the estate. I have seen estates that have taken longer than 2 years. I've seen an estate take almost 4 years, but often those very long cases would be a particular issue, often with an offshore asset or something that's really difficult to administer overseas. But if it's a normal local estate, I think the sort of standard time at the moment is anywhere between 12 and 18 months as your sort of normal turnaround time for an estate to be wound up. So I think it's important that individuals are aware of that and how long that can take. So importance of beneficiary nominations. So, what is a beneficiary nomination? That's really a written nomination that one makes that they can make on certain assets or investment policies or life insurance policies that would mean that those policies aren't administered by the will. Those policies would generally be handled on those as per those beneficiary nominations. So those beneficiary nominations would really overrule any wishes that are stated in the will. So I've just listed some types of investment accounts and insurance policies that allow beneficiary nominations. So your normal endowment policies and wrappers, your retirement funds would ordinarily have beneficiary nominations like living annuities. Your life insurance policies, funeral policies, and certain tax-free investments also allow beneficiary nominations. Now on this slide, I'm just going to cover, what does that mean, having a beneficiary nomination? How would that benefit you? So remember, anything with a beneficiary nomination, the executor is not going to physically handle themselves. So that means the executor's fee calculation would not include those assets in that calculation. So they can save potentially up to 4%, depending on the executor fee rate, on the value of those assets. So that can be quite material. Like I mentioned earlier, on a 10 million rand investment portfolio, if you put it in an endowment account with the beneficiary nomination allowed, they could potentially save you up to 400,000 rand. So that's quite important to be aware of, is, to do a bit of an assessment of which of your assets has beneficiary nominations or not, and make sure that a bit of strategic thinking is done around that. The nice thing about beneficiary nominations is those beneficiaries would go through a separate claim process. So if you nominated as a beneficiary of a life policy or a wrapper, you would do a claim form to say, I'm now the new owner of the investment, or I would like to take proceeds of that policy. And that's outside of waiting for the executor. So that often takes a lot quicker than the up to 2 years that an estate takes. I mean, claiming an investment or a life policy as a beneficiary should take a number of months instead of years. So it can give you nice access to liquid capital a lot quicker. If the spouse is a beneficiary of a policy, what's great is that there's no executive fees and there's no estate duty, because as we said earlier, Section 4Q means any assets moving from one spouse to another, there's no estate duty payable. These days, for a lot of different policies, you can either say you want to have a beneficiary for proceeds, which means as a beneficiary, you would receive the cash of that policy, whether that's a life insurance policy that pays you a certain death benefit, or an endowment policy that would basically become paid up, and the proceeds of that would be paid to your bank account. Or you could do, which is becoming a lot more increasingly common, is to say, I'm going to have a beneficiary for ownership. So I've got a 10 million rand investment that's in a wrapper. I don't want that to just be paid out to my child or whoever it may be. I want them to take ownership of that portfolio and carry on with that investment. And they can decide once they own that investment if they wanted to make, partial or full withdrawal. So that would be called a beneficiary for ownership. And I think that my final point just around beneficiary nominations is I see a lot that the beneficiary nominations don't really talk hand in hand with the will. So what the wishes are stated in one's will must match up with the beneficiary nominations on their various life policies or endowment or wrapper investments. Because you can see sometimes things are strategically written up in a will, expecting money to go a certain way from the other policies, and the policies aren't in fact written up in the same way. So it's just to make sure that there's an exercise done where that's all checked together. Okay, so now we've just got 3 practical examples we're going to run through, and then it's just a few closing points before I know Nick's got some questions for me. So here we've got example number 1, more of a retirement example. So we've got Mrs. Retiree. She's 75, she's widowed, and she has 3 adult children. In terms of her assets, I think it's quite common assets that she has, is she's got her primary home she lives in, she's got a living annuity, which is obviously like a pension investment that she has, and she has a unit trust and savings investments to the value of 3.5 million. So she, when speaking with, let's say, her financial planner or her estate planner, her wishes are that her children would get 30% each of her assets, and her selected cause or charity would get 10% of her assets on her passing. Mrs. Retiree is currently drawing the minimum income allowed from her living annuity, because I think it's quite normal when you're working, you're always told to leave your pension to grow as long as possible and don't touch it. And what she's doing is she's actually living off her other savings and her unit trust accounts. She's drawing the minimum amount allowed from the living annuity. So just now we're sitting and we're going through the solutions with her. And given the fact that her children intend to receive cash lump sums from Mrs. Retiree if she passes away, they're not interested in getting any income. they want to get the cash for their own purposes, she could rather draw all of her income from her living annuity and leave the unit trusts and savings to grow. So why do we say that? A living annuity can be tax efficient as an estate planning tool, or it could potentially not be tax efficient depending on what the decision of the beneficiary is going to be. If the beneficiaries decide to draw the whole living annuity, or the same rules apply for a retirement annuity or pension fund as cash, then that whole lump sum would be taxed up to 36%. If you compare that 36% to estate duty is just 20%. So potentially, in her case, she's got 4 million in a living annuity and 3.5 million in savings and unit trusts. If she drew that 3.5 million down to zero and passed away just with the 4 million rand, the children would inherit the 4 million rand less 36%. If she did it the other way around and rather had them inherit the unit trusts and savings, they would get that amount less only 20%. So it's just a bit of a technical thing on the different tax rates that apply on death in this scenario. The next practical example, this one relates to liquidity, which I think it's an enormously valuable example, this one. So Mr. Businessman is 58 and he's divorced and he has no children. So he's got a very nice primary residence with a market value of 8 million. He's also got a property overseas for 4 million market value. He also has a living annuity. He's got an investment portfolio, but his is offshore and it's in a wrapper worth 15 million rand. And he has some physical gold that's worth 500,000 rand. So Mr. Businessman has nominated his siblings as his heirs. His brother lives in South Africa, and Mr. Businessman is the brother will inherit the house, the living annuity, and the gold, really the assets that are in South Africa. The sister will inherit the overseas property and take ownership of the offshore wrapper because the sister lives overseas. So it makes sense for the sister to inherit the foreign currency assets. If you work it out, it's quite even what the brother will get and what the sister will get. Now, what Mr. Businessman hasn't considered is the liquidity to pay all his estate costs. If you look at his assets, there's nothing that's liquid there. He's got properties, which obviously you would have to sell the properties to realize any cash. He's got a living annuity, where if you had to liquidate that 36% tax rate I just mentioned would apply. He's got an offshore wrapper portfolio that sits outside of South Africa. Now, he could use some of that, but he may not want to use some of that. And then he's got physical gold, which, once again, you could sell, but he may not want to sell it. So we estimate that his estate duty would be around 5.5 million, and his executor's fees would be about 500,000 rand. And that's the cost that this estate would need to fund. If we just go down there to the conclusion of this example, Mr. Businessman's estate has a liquidity problem. There's no obvious cash to pay estate costs of around 6 million rand. So what could Mr. Businessman do? He could either nominate some of his offshore wrapper to pay straight to his estate. So in this case, if he needs 6 million rand, he could say 40% of my wrapper will go to my estate. So that would then avoid the full amount of 15 million going to his sister overseas, but that decision would obviously reduce the amount that the sister would get. Or another option could be to say, I don't want any of these assets to be liquidated or to be have to contribute to estate duty. I'm rather going to take a life insurance policy out, assuming that Mr. Businessman is insurable, and I'm going to take a life insurance policy out and I'm going to fund that for the 6 million plus to pay for these costs. Now, Mr. Businessman could also go to his brother and sister and say, listen, these are the assets that you're going to potentially get if something happens to me. Would you like to contribute to a life insurance policy to avoid your assets values being reduced? So I think that's the kind of practical discussion that when you go through a liquidity analysis is what it's called, and you put in all of your different investments, whether it's retirement funds, properties, investments, companies, shares in companies, etc., loan accounts, to and from trusts. You can get quite a detailed liquidity conclusion that will tell you if you have a liquidity surplus or shortfall, and then you can decide what sort of solution you'll put in place for that. And then just the final example, we've got Mr. Investor. He's 64 years old and he's married to Mrs. Investor. And he's also got a primary residence. He's got a holiday home on the coast. He's got his unit trust portfolio in South Africa that is wrapped. So it's wrapped, which means it's got a beneficiary nomination on it. He's got a family trust. So family trust isn't technically an asset in his name. I just wanted to mention that he does have a family trust that he's set up, and he's got a pension income that he gets from a guaranteed pension he got from his employment. His will currently states that all his assets are going to go to his family trust for the benefit of his spouse, and thereafter, once the spouse has passed away, his children and his grandchildren. Now, what Mr. Investor and Mr. Investor's lawyer are forgetting about is the benefit of Section 4Q, which states that all assets transferred between spouses are exempt from estate duty. So in this example, if Mr. Investor rather nominated his spouse as the beneficiary or the heir in his will, instead of the family trust, on that transfer of assets on his passing, we estimate that the state duty saving would be around 2.9 million rand. So it's not to say that you don't pay that ever, because when Mrs. Investor passes away, she will potentially have to pay estate duty, but you never know when that might be. Mrs. Investor might live another 20 years, 30 years, and these assets could either appreciate in value or depreciate if she's obviously living off them for a long time. I think the big thing is that what you're doing is you're delaying the payment of estate duty, so you're avoiding the capital being reduced right away when you pass away, and you're letting that capital grow in your family members' hands for longer. And then obviously when Mrs. Investor passes away, then her will can say that everything would go to the family trust on behalf of the children and grandchildren. So this is just an example about how material Section 4Q can be, and making sure that you take that into account. So just going to run through what are some key documents to potentially have in place. I mean, the main one and obvious one is to have a will, or what's called a last will and testament. This document will list, all of your personal details, your family members' personal details, and what assets you have and how you would like those assets to be distributed after your death. The will could potentially appoint an executor for your estate. And then some additional documents that would normally go on the back of a will would be what's called a living will. Living will is like a one-page, almost like an addendum at the back of a will, which says what your preferences would be for medical treatment if you became incapacitated. Your will can also say what your preferences in terms of burial or cremation, or things like that, funeral preferences, anything can be listed there. An additional document is what's called a power of attorney. So this is what this page would grant someone the authority to make financial and legal decisions on your behalf if you're unable to do so. So I think a power of attorney, that doesn't mean someone signs, and takes over your decision making, but it allows them to be able to, for instance, if you can't physically sign forms anymore, if you're not able to represent yourself in a financial capacity, that power of attorney will allow that person to apply either to the courts or to the financial institutions to say, I would like to sign on behalf of my family member. I think a big one, and this is one I see that I think a lot of people don't do this, is to have an inventory of your assets and liabilities. Because, I mean, often one spouse may have very little idea of the actual details of amounts and account numbers and where one's investments and assets sit. So just to have that printed out with your will somewhere, kept in a safe somewhere in your home or at your lawyer's office, I think is enormously important. A trust deed, that would be if you had a family trust. The trust deed would say how that family trust is managed and who the persons to that family trust would be. And I think a bit of a new age one that I've included, I know certainly my wife and I have this, and I've read it in some other fiduciary articles, is something I think a lot of people would never think about, is a password register. So these days, we all have our online banking. We have certain things like our email accounts, even potentially our social media like Facebook. I mean, for instance, on Facebook, if no one can log in and potentially delete your account after you pass away, your account can sit there forever. So I think just to give it a bit of thought and do a bit of a register for your important passwords. I know when we've done the exercise, you would be shocked how many sort of online accounts you have that you need to write your passwords down for. Okay, so just my final key takeaways before I hand back to Nick. I think first one, estate planning and retirement planning must go hand in hand. I mean, you can see it if you focus only on retirement planning and investment planning, you can plan everything to be tax efficient while you're alive and, you know, for your money to last a nice amount of time, but it might be ultra inefficient when it comes to estate planning, being practical when winding up an estate, and in terms of estate costs. So I think there has to be a good balance between trying to manage estate costs and trying to manage taxes while you're alive, especially if you're still sort of in working age or just early in retirement. I think planning, you know, to reduce tax while you're alive is potentially going to be, more pressing than trying to reduce estate duty that might only have to be paid in 30 or 40 years. Be practical with your estate planning and retirement planning actions. I've seen a lot where the will might say something that really doesn't make sense with how the investments have been set up. So just to make sure and get a professional opinion that what you've actually written down is going to work practically. You don't want it to be, you know, for instance, a basic example is a joint account in South Africa. You put all your money into a joint account with your spouse in South Africa, let's say like a unit trust account. I mean, in South Africa, joint accounts, if one spouse passes away, that account gets frozen by the financial institution. So how is the surviving spouse going to access that money? It can be very difficult. So just to make sure that you're aware of the practical implications of what you do financially, little things like whose name you put assets in, what beneficiaries you put, and what your will says, little nuances can really make a big difference. The Mr. Businessman example, plan where your estate costs are going to be paid from, especially if there's not obvious liquid assets like cash. So in this day and age, a lot of people have assets overseas, investments overseas. They're putting assets into their trusts and companies. So what assets do you actually have in your name, or cash do you have in your name that's going to cover your personal estate duty, etc., etc.? Repaying your own liabilities, such as loan accounts that you have to your trusts and companies. So just planning of how you're going to fund that, whether you use certain investment proceeds to fund that, or like I said, the other option is to use actual life insurance just to fund that, and that leaves the whole estate untouched. Talk to your heirs and beneficiaries. I can think practically that this is something people might not want to do. You don't want to get people's hopes up, or you don't want to create expectation. But I think it can be very valuable just to have an idea, you know, your children or your spouse or your siblings, would they like to receive a lump sum? Are they going to use the money you're going to give them to buy a home or invest in something? Or would they rather receive an income? I think these sort of things with your spouse is a lot more straightforward, because often a spouse would be more of a joint financial planning relationship. But giving money to siblings or friends or children, it's just to have an idea of can they handle receiving that money, how would they like to receive that money, and then there are potential solutions like using trusts or investment wrappers and how you manage them getting that money. Okay, and finally from me, before I give it back to Nick, is just to review your estate plan and will after major life events. So major life events, any addition of new family members you might want to include, sadly, the loss of any family members, moving home and moving your country of residence. I think those are really important events where you just have to have a little think. Do I need to relook at how my will's written up? Do I need to go look at my beneficiary nominations to see that they're up to date? Okay, thanks, Nick. I know I rattled off for a while there.
Well done.
But yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, listen, you covered a lot there. Thank you very much. I think, a big thing with, all the details is then to choose the right professional. Always difficult. This is something we go through with prospective clients. I always feel sorry for them. How do you find the right person? And that's why we really put the slide up. Make sure that they're experienced, they're qualified. Obviously, trustworthy is difficult to determine. Try and get some references from other clients. Ensure that there's a team approach and that they're also available. So just little things just to tick off when trying to find a professional. I think having a little system is worthwhile, just to give you peace of mind that you're finding the right person. Certainly, from our side, we can do that. We have partners that assist us with trusts, complex tax, wills, other fiduciary issues. We can assist you with that. Right, the one key, I must say, for me, one of probably the biggest thing is to ensure that your estate plan integrates with your retirement plan. I know Stuart mentioned that first, but that's really important. And if you do a retirement plan, or as we call it broadly, a financial plan, it gives you fantastic visibility. And I think that's really powerful and give you some real peace of mind. Right, we've got a few questions. If you stick around, I think a few are pretty interesting. One is, do you need a foreign will if you have offshore assets, or can you just have one will? Stuart, what do you say?
Yeah, so you can just have one will. Often they might call it a worldwide will that would speak to your local and offshore assets. I know practically it's not recommended. If you've got foreign assets and you've got local assets, it's generally suggested to have a will in every jurisdiction where you have assets. Because what happens if you have a worldwide will or a local will that speaks to everything, then your little South African executor has to wind up all of your assets, plus can charge executor fees on your worldwide assets. So that could be quite a process. That local executor needs to appoint a foreign attorney, what they call in certain countries probate, which is like the executorship over there. There can be a duplication of fees. So just in summary, to answer, if you've got assets overseas, I would have a will in the country where I've got those assets, to make sure there's an attorney there that will just handle, let's say you've got a property in Europe somewhere or an investment account overseas, to handle those assets separately.
Okay, all right, thanks, Stuart. Another interesting one, you were speaking about beneficiaries and nominating beneficiaries. So if all in your estate, all the assets are paid out to beneficiaries, how does the estate end up paying the estate duty?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and a scenario that can happen, Nick. So for instance, if someone doesn't really have any assets of their own that the executor can sell, so if you don't have a house or any savings, but for instance, you had life insurance or other policies that just paid out directly to beneficiaries. So now the beneficiaries receive that money before the executor is actually doing the liquidation and distribution accounts and paying the tax returns. There's not going to be any money for the executor to use. So it's called apportionment, where SARS/the executor, whoever's representing, would have to go back to the beneficiaries and what's called apportion the estate duty payable to them. So whatever percentage they received of that estate dutiable amount, they would need to chip in and pay. So they basically would have their life insurance proceeds or investment proceeds reduced. And one would hope that they've still got some money left to pay that, because that can be something they would be liable for.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Stuart. I've just got one last one, which also practically. So what happens if your spouse and yourself pass away at the same time? How would that pan out?
Yeah. So normally,
well, effectively, the question really is that if your will leaves everything to your spouse,
yes,
but unfortunately you both pass on at the same time, then who gets the assets?
Yeah. So what happens is normally it would be standard that your will should have, your first heir, what's called a residuary heir, so who's going to inherit your assets, and then it should have, if that residuary heir has passed away, X, Y, Z. Practically, if you have minor children, you can decide if you want your assets to go to a guardian or to a trust, like what's called a testamentary trust on behalf of those minor children. If you didn't say anything in your will about what would happen if you and your spouse passed away and maybe you didn't have children, then your assets would be governed. Or if you pass away without a will, I'll mention, your assets governed by a thing called interstate succession, which basically is it's rules that the government have come up with of who's going to get your assets. So basically, you lose your discretion if you pass away without a will, and there's certain rules we would just say who gets your money or your assets, and that's really just your blood family relatives that the executor would go out there to go and establish. Also, separately from a will, if you had an investment like a wrapper or an offshore wrapper, they would normally have your primary beneficiary and your secondary beneficiaries. So I know commonly you could say your spouse would be your primary beneficiary and your children would be your secondary beneficiaries. And you can even go further down like that. So that means you would be spelling out who the next in line to inherit would be.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks, Stuart. We're going to wrap it up here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you need any help or assistance, you can get our contact details, obviously on the website, investonline.co.za. Also, if you'd like to watch a recording, we'll put it up on the website. You can also have a look at our other webinars. In the first two, the overseas one, investing offshore, and the living annuity webinar as well. Thank you for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yes.